Chapter 2. The Black Armband. Kessrin, the sparkling jewel of the Bay of Doves, the undisputed maritime capital of the 9 baronies. And it is indeed a wonderful, magical place. The view from the top of the central tower is breathtaking. Why, on a clear day, you can see halfway to Arelium. I just wish it didn't smell so much of raw seaweed and rotten fish. Zandris, Healer's Apprentice, 426 AT. My lady? Jelaïa groaned and rolled over onto her stomach. Why was this mattress so hard? It felt like someone had removed all the soft, downy feathers and replaced them with a sack of gravel. She would have a talk with Maver about it in the morning. Then, as her mind pushed through the last clinging tendrils of sleep, she remembered where she was, miles away from Arelium, and her comfortable 4-poster bed, lying on a patch of dry ground 20 yards from the banks of the River Stahl, with only her travelling cloak between her and the cold, hard earth. My lady, is it time? She boldly raised an eyelid just a crack. It was enough to make out the imposing figure of Aldurin, Knight of the 12, staring down at her with a concerned expression on his face. He truly was an impressive sight. Over 7 feet of tanned, muscular physique, from his scarred and battered face down to his powerful thighs and calves. Jelaïa could read nothing in his calm features and piercing ocean blue eyes, but she knew he was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action at the slightest hint of danger. It was one of the many things she knew about Aldurin. Since their blood had mixed in the soggy marshlands east of Arelium, she had shared his memories, his thoughts and his fears. She had seen him hold the hand of his dying mother as the light left her eyes, watched him climb the sheer cliffs of Kessrin, and felt the tremors running down his arms as he forged the massive double-bladed axe that never left his side. Years of suffering and hardship compressed into a single burst of energy that had set her veins on fire, an agonizing wave of pain rippling through her body more intense than anything she had ever felt before. And yet, she had sensed something else too. At the very moment the burning fire reached its paroxysm, a feeling of unbridled, limitless potential. Fleeting, yet intoxicating. It would perhaps be worth a little pain to experience that sensation again. She rubbed her itching eyes and stifled a yawn. "I'm awake," she mumbled groggily, patting at her mop of chestnut brown hair. The humid river air had curled and twisted her shoulder-length locks, making them writhe like a nest of angry serpents. Thank the 12 she had at least had the sense to dress correctly. Her leather trousers and crimson doublet were muddy and stained, but otherwise intact. Anything more ladylike would have already been torn to shreds on the sharp stones that littered the riverbank. Aldurin looked as tired as she felt. The ugly welts and bruises on his face, the direct result of him jumping off a collapsing gatehouse and fighting 2 fallen knights of the 12, were slowly waning from a dark shade of purple to a brownish yellow. Jelaïa was more worried about the puncture wound in his shoulder. The opposing knight's blade had cut deep and wide. Aldurin would need stitches for the muscle to heal properly. She had packed the wound with mud to reduce the risk of infection and bandaged it as best she could, but she knew it was still causing him some pain. The worst injury, however, was not to the tall knight's body, but to his spirit. As an initiate, Aldurin had been told the story of the great schism that had divided the Knights of the 12, a day of bloodshed followed by years of infighting and betrayals that had led to the decline of his order and the creation of the scrying. It was a terrible, unforgettable scar on the temple's history, but only its oldest members had actually raised arms against their brothers. Until now. Aldurin had faced off against 2 fallen knights of Methuna, and he had lost. Jelaïa glanced past the knight to where his cracked helm lay by the glowing embers of the campfire. The symbolism was obvious. She only wished she could do more to help, but he had been mostly silent since they had left Arelium behind and, after a few fruitless attempts at conversation, she had given up. Aldurin was staring at her expectantly, and she realized that she had missed what he had been saying. "I am sorry, Sir Knight. My mind was elsewhere."
"We are close to Kessrin now, my lady," he repeated patiently. "I would estimate that if we set off now, we should reach the port by early afternoon. I have prepared some sustenance." The River Stahl was the main source of fresh drinking water for animals living in the hills, rabbits, mice, and other small rodents. Aldurin had set up traps whenever they stopped to rest. While he hunted, Jelaïa had scoured the riverbank for fruits and berries, using her rudimentary knowledge of medicine to avoid the deadlier varieties. Aldurin had wrapped the remains of last night's rabbit in dock leaves and placed it over the dying fire. The rich, juicy smell of cooked meat wafted over her and made her mouth water in anticipation. She speared the steaming packet with the dagger that she kept belted to her waist and sliced off a long strip of flesh.
"Have you ever met Baron del Kessrin?" she said through a mouthful of rabbit. "I saw him a few times when he came to visit my father, but we never really spoke, apart from the necessary pleasantries."
"I have met him several times." Aldurin had seated himself on a nearby log and was sharpening his double-bladed axe with a whetstone.
Jelaïa knew he did this not only to keep his weapon sharp, but also because the rhythmic gesture calmed him. "What did you think of him?" she asked.
"He is a difficult man to describe. Very different from your father. Listus is, at heart, an open, straightforward man who wears his intentions clearly on his sleeve. He is a man who speaks his mind, sometimes rather impulsively, I might add. It is one of the things I like about him. Both Listus and Reed have a tendency to be quite undiplomatic when they feel like it. It is very refreshing."
Jelaïa suppressed a smile as she remembered her father ordering Aldurin to take her to Kessrin, no matter the cost. The knight had responded by destroying the bedroom wall with his axe. By the 12, it would be good to see her family again.
"Dorello del Kessrin is much better at hiding his true intentions. He has neither the martial prowess nor the imposing presence of your father. Yet he manages to turn this weakness into an advantage. Every time I see him, his clothes are more opulent, his manners more extravagant. It is all a lure. Many have underestimated him, and have woken up the next morning to find themselves swindled out of a trade deal or bound by some contract or other to serve the Baron's interests."
"The next morning?"
"Indeed. It appears that Dorello also has a voracious sexual appetite. Something to watch out for, methinks."
"But I am the Baron's daughter."
"Exactly. You would be a fine prize, I am sure. Now, if you have finished, I would suggest we proceed. We do not want to keep the Baron waiting."
Kessrin was an imposing sight. It straddled the estuary where the River Stahl met the Bay of Doves. Countless wharves, jetties, piers, and quays, weaving forth from its base like an entanglement of intertwining roots. A crenellated wall of ashen-grey stone separated the ports from the town itself, much like at Arelium, although no guards manned the ramparts. In lieu of a defensive barbican, there were 5 wide gates allowing the hundreds of sailors, traders, and other visitors passage into the town centre, where a magnificent feat of architecture awaited them. 4 cylindrical towers with conical blue-tiled roofs encircled the 5th central tower, higher and wider than the rest, perfectly positioned to dominate the estuary, the Bay of Doves, and the raging tides of the Sea of Sorrow beyond. It was from the top of the central tower that Baron Dorello del Kessrin surveyed his domain. The surrounding towers were linked to one another by elevated stone walkways, no more than 4 feet wide. They were closed off at night or during particularly bad weather, but remained no less treacherous to the untrained or incautious. Jelaïa and Aldurin reached the outer jetties in the early afternoon. They refused to pay the exorbitant mooring fees and set their battered boat adrift to float downstream and out to sea. The jetties were packed with boats of all shapes and sizes, flat cargo barges from Morlak or Arelium, bigger merchant ships from up the coast near Talth or further north, and even a few carracks, massive multi-decked monstrosities employed to patrol the waters around Kessrin or act as an escort for some of the more dangerous trade routes. Their decks bristled with ballistae, large crossbow-like weapons that could propel 6-foot-long iron-tipped bolts hundreds of yards across the water. These ships of war were financed by the noble houses of Kessrin, and all sported various shields, pennants, and banners, proclaiming their patronage. One coat of arms stood out from all the others, a white-winged sea serpent on a field of dark blue, the personal heraldry of Baron del Kessrin. After days of near silence, the vibrant thrum of civilization was deafening. Jelaïa had barely stepped off the quay before she bumped into a barrel of fresh fish, spilling its slippery contents all over the boardwalk. The irate owner swaggered over and seemed ready to throw her back into the water, until Aldurin calmly intervened. The Temple of Brachyura was only a day or two's ride away from the provincial capital, and the men and women of Kessrin were used to seeing the initiates and priestesses of the order. The boat captain bowed respectfully to the knight and, with a final dark look at Jelaïa, returned to join his crew. "Stay close," said Aldurin, and began to thread his way through the throng of sailors and merchants towards the closest gate. They were waved in by a pair of bored town guards wearing boiled leather breastplates and wide blue knee-length breeches and stockings. The narrow cobbled street on the other side was packed with people and wound up past houses and shops to the circle of tall towers overlooking the town. Humidity, sea salt, and harsh winds determined the style and shape of the buildings. Residences were squat, angular structures of granite or fieldstone with thin, glassless windows and flat roofs. Some of the more elaborate houses had blue-tiled coverings or wooden struts, a clear sign of wealth, considering the cost of maintaining such fragile materials. Jelaïa managed to advance a few hundred yards before she was accosted by a band of grubby orphans, their hollowed cheeks and weathered faces making them look far older than they really were. She gave them the last few bits of meat and cheese from her satchel of supplies, and their leader tugged his forelock before cartwheeling away with a gap-toothed smile. It made her think of the refugees from Arelium, who must still be here somewhere. She hoped they were being well looked after. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached the base of one of the towers, and it was now apparent that all 5 towers rose from a single rounded stone base 3 stories high, like the skeletal fingers and thumb of an enormous hand. A lowered portcullis blocked further progress. Next to it, a bronze bell set into the wall allowed visitors to announce themselves. Aldurin rang the bell, and a moment later, a round, tonsured head popped out of one of the openings on the 2nd floor. "Yes?" the head inquired. "Aldurin, Knight of Brachyura and Lady Jelaïa del Arelium. We would like to speak to the Baron immediately." The guardsman squinted down at Jelaïa, taking in her travel-worn clothes and straggly hair. "Pardon me, my lady, but you don't much look like a baron's daughter." "Yes, I hear that a lot," said Jelaïa in exasperation. "Now would you please give me your name and rank so I can convey to his Lord Baron exactly who delayed us from meeting with him?" The head withdrew and after a muffled conversation reappeared again, looking suitably chastised.
My most humble apologies, Lady del Arelium. Once the portcullis is raised, please proceed directly through the courtyard to the central tower. I will send a messenger to inform the Baron of your presence." With a squeal of rusty gears, the portcullis trundled upwards, and the pair of travellers entered the Baron's keep. They were greeted by an open courtyard surrounded on all sides by marble columns. Multiple corridors branched out from the square towards the other towers. Floral archways covered a slate pathway that led from the gatehouse to a pair of reinforced doors on the far side. In the centre, a 9-foot-high granite statue of a writhing sea snake spiraled up into the air, the creature's stone eyes fixed on the central tower. As they reached the double doors, the latter were pulled open from the inside by 2 vigilant soldiers. Jelaïa gasped as she stepped into the great hall of Kessrin. It took up almost the entire ground floor of the central tower, its circular walls lined with the colourful heraldry of the vassals who had pledged their allegiance to the Baron. A series of columns placed strategically around the room up to its vaulted ceiling. Opposite where Jelaïa now stood was what had made her gasp. An enormous stained-glassed window dominated the hall, vibrant hues of red, blue, green, and yellow illuminating the walls and dappling the stone floor with multicolored patches of light. The window depicted a golden armored woman with flowing auburn hair battling a dark green tentacled creature resembling a large squid or octopus, complete with angry, beady eyes and a gaping maw filled with pointed teeth. The woman wore an expression of almost religious zeal, stabbing down triumphantly with a 2-handed sword, impaling the monster through one eye. In front of this striking image on a raised dais stood 4 high-backed chairs and a long oaken table. 3 of the chairs were occupied. Baron Jelaïa del Kessrin lounged nonchalantly in the middle seat, one leg hooked over an armrest. His short black hair was expertly styled, slick and greased with some kind of natural gel. He was wearing heavy amounts of dense black eyeliner and a slender trace of dark red lipstick. More makeup darkened his features, giving him a slight tan and making it difficult for Jelaïa to guess his age. He could be anything from 30 to 50. A tiny diamond earring pierced his left ear, sparkling in the light of the stained glass window. He looked bored. To the Baron's left, a tall, thin woman with square-cut grey hair sat up straight and stiff, her spine pressed against the wooden back of her chair as if glued there. She wore a simple black dress and bodice with a starched collar fastened tightly around her neck. She was staring thoughtfully at Jelaïa over steepled fingers, her brow creased and lips pursed. The last of the Great Hall's occupants was a short, pudgy, sandy-haired man with a cropped goatee doing little to hide his generous chin and jaw. A pair of wire-framed glasses hung on a frayed cord around his neck, and various scrolls and parchments were scattered over the table in front of him. The Baron's eyes lit up when he caught sight of Jelaïa. He bounded out of his chair and leapt down from the dais to stand before her. Jelaïa bowed deeply, extending his arm and wrist in a gentlemanly flourish. Before Jelaïa could react, he grabbed her hand and pressed it fervently to his lips. He smelled strongly of flowers and southern spices. "My lady," he murmured. Jelaïa made to curtsy in return, remembered she was wearing trousers, and gave an awkward bow instead. "Lord Baron, it is so good to see you," she replied. There was something odd about the Baron, a strange look in his eye that she could not quite place. Something about his attire, too. He was wearing a black doublet and shirt, black trousers, and black doeskin boots. Hadn't Alderin told her that Jelaïa was an extravagant overdresser? Her eyes flickered to the other 2 seated figures,
The woman in her dark dress and the bespectacled man. He had shifted in his chair, fiddling with one of the scrolls on the table, and Jelaïa could see now that he wore a black armband on his right side. A feeling of insufferable dread began to seep through her body. She inhaled sharply as her hands started to shake. She turned to Alderin and saw the grief written on his face. "My lady, I have terrible news," said the Baron softly. Then Jelaïa's world came crashing down, and she heard no more.